Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tia Inniss, and I'm a research officer at the Central Bank of Barbados. And today I'm just going to do a brief presentation on a topic that I'm currently working on, which is the impact of U.S. trade policies on tourist arrivals to CARICOM. Okay, so just showing the outline for today's presentation, I will start with a brief background on trade policies, where we'll then move on to the motivation behind the study, then take you through some relevant literature pertaining to this study, the theoretical framework and methodology, the results and discussion, and lastly, some policy implications. Okay, so to understand the motivation behind this study, it's important to start with some background information on trade policies. Trade policies are the rules and tools governments use to regulate international trade. These can include tariffs, quotas, or broader agreements aimed at promoting cross-border exchange. Historically, US trade policy evolved from strict protectionism in the 1800s, used to protect domestic industries, to reciprocal agreements after World War II, and eventually to modern trade liberalization with agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement and the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act. But it's not just the agreements themselves that matter, it's also the uncertainty around them. So the concept of trade policy uncertainty reflects how unpredictable and volatile the trade environment can become. This can influence investor confidence, economic activity, and as this study explores tourist behavior. So the motivation behind this study is rooted in the Caribbean's deep dependence on tourism, and more specifically on US tourist arrivals. For many CARICOM countries, tourism is not just important, it's central to their economic survival. In places like Jamaica and Barbados, tourism contributes significantly to GDP and employment. However, these countries are becoming increasingly vulnerable to external shocks, especially those originating in the US. One such factor is trade policy uncertainty, where sudden shifts in tariffs, regulations, or rhetoric can ripple through global markets. During the Trump administration, for example, new tariffs and retaliatory threats led to a surge in uncertainty and a drop in investor and consumer confidence. But while there's been a lot of research on how trade policies affect trade flows or GDP, very few studies have looked at how these same policies affect the tourism sector, particularly in small tourism-reliant economies like those in the Caribbean. So this study aims to bridge that gap by exploring how US trade policies, including formal agreements and broader measures of trade uncertainty, translate into shifts in tourism demand. Ultimately, the goal is to help policymakers in CARICOM understand how interconnected their tourism sectors are with US economic and policy decisions, and to develop strategies that are more resilient to these shocks. So the main research questions this paper will seek to answer are: number one, what impact do US trade policies have on tourist arrivals to selected CARICOM countries? Number two, how do key regional agreements affect international tourism flows to the CARICOM region? And lastly, to what extent do macroeconomic factors influence tourism demand within CARICOM countries? So let's now turn to the literature that supports this study. First, US trade policy has a long and complex evolution, from protectionist tariffs in the 1800s to reciprocal trade agreements post-World War II, and eventually liberal trade deals like the North American Free Trade Agreement and the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act. More recently, however, we've seen rising protectionism, especially under the Trump administration, which spurred increased trade policy uncertainty. In parallel, the literature on tourism in small island developing states, like those in CARICOM, consistently shows that tourism is a vital economic pillar. It contributes up to 14% of GDP in the region and provides thousands of jobs. But it's also highly vulnerable to external shocks, especially those stemming from large partner economies like the US. Some studies show that trade agreements can boost tourism indirectly. For example, Pham et al. 2023 found that regional trade agreements significantly increased international tourist flows to Vietnam. Moreover, the growing body of work on trade policy uncertainties, such as Becker and Schroeder 2020, shows that Uncertainty reduces investment and confidence, which can spill over into sectors like tourism. So in the US, Rulison 2025 documented a 25% drop in Canadian tourism due to trade tensions. So this study is grounded in two interrelated frameworks, the gravity model and tourism demand theory. The gravity model, borrowed from trade economics, has been widely applied to tourism studies. It suggests that flows between two regions, in this case tourism flows, are positively related to the economic size of the origin and destination, and negatively related to the distance between them. So in simpler terms, richer countries send more tourists, and countries that are geographically closer see more tourism. Quem 2010 found strong evidence for this model when applied to tourism data in Korea. Complementing that is tourism demand theory, which highlights the importance of income, relative prices, travel costs, and external uncertainty in influencing travel decisions. For example, higher GDP per capita in a destination suggests better infrastructure and amenities, while higher trade policy uncertainty can deter travel due to perceived instability or risk. So these frameworks help to make sense of the results later on. They show how structural variables like income and distance, combined with shocks and policies, shape real-world tourism patterns. The methodology aligns with prior empirical work, including Pham et al. 2023, who used a similar gravity-based structure to evaluate trade agreements and tourism in Vietnam. So the methodology for this study follows a quantitative panel data approach based on the gravity model framework I described earlier. The model is estimated using a fixed effects approach to control for unobserved heterogeneity, meaning differences between CARICOM countries that do not change over time, like culture or geographic position. The data spans from 1996 to 2021 and includes 12 CARICOM countries, such as Jamaica, Barbados, and St. Lucia. In addition to standard economic indicators, I incorporated dummy variables for major events and agreements, the Economic Partnership Agreement, the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the COVID-19 pandemic. I also created two key interaction terms to examine whether the effects of trade policy uncertainty were amplified during the pandemic and whether GDP growth had a stronger effect during the North American Free Trade Agreement active period. All estimates were computed using eViews, and I applied robust diagnostic tests to ensure the model's validity, including tests for heteroscedasticity, cross-sectional dependence, and autocorrelation. I also used clustered robust standard errors to ensure reliable inference. So this slide here outlines the key variables used in the econometric model. Starting with the dependent variable, I used the log difference of total tourist arrivals to each CARICOM country. This transformation accounts for growth rates and ensures comparability across countries and time. The independent variables are grounded in the gravity model. First, I included GDP per capita of each CARICOM country, logged and difference, since income levels help explain a country's capacity to invest in tourism infrastructure and attract visitors. Next is the US Trade Policy Uncertainty Index, also logged on difference, which reflects fluctuations in US trade-related risk. The third is geographic distance, a key control in gravity models, capturing the effect of physical proximity on tourism flows. I also incorporated dummy variables for 4 key policy and event milestones. These help isolate the effect of each agreement or shock on tourist arrivals, assuming a value of 1 during the relevant years and 0 otherwise. To deepen the analysis, I included 2 key interaction terms. The first combines trade policy uncertainty with COVID-19 to see whether trade uncertainty had a larger impact during the pandemic, and the second tests whether GDP per capita had a stronger effect during the North American Free Trade Agreement period, which could suggest that income-led tourism demand was influenced by broader trade integration. Now I'll walk you through the main results of the model, starting with the statistically significant findings. The Trade Policy Uncertainty Index showed a strong negative impact So a 1% increase in trade policy uncertainty leads to a 0.08% decline in tourist arrivals to CARICOM countries. This indicates that when trade policy becomes more unpredictable, consumers are less willing to spend on international travel, possibly due to economic anxiety or volatility in the source country. The Economic Partnership Agreement dummy variable had a statistically significant negative effect of 2.18%, suggesting that this trade agreement, while beneficial for goods trade, may have unintended negative consequences for tourism. As expected from gravity theory, greater geographic distance from the US was associated with fewer tourist arrivals. In addition, the interaction term between trade policy uncertainty and COVID-19 pandemic was highly significant and strongly negative. This shows that trade uncertainty became even more damaging when combined with the global health crisis, underscoring how compounded shocks affect tourism flows in small, vulnerable economies. While GDP per capita was not statistically significant, its positive signs suggest that income levels do matter, but their impact may be muted by external shocks. Similarly, both the North American Free Trade Agreement and the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act had positive but statistically insignificant effects, possibly due to lagged or indirect channels of infrastructure development. In terms of model performance, the R squared of 0.696 means the model explains nearly 70% of the variation in tourist arrivals. The diagnostics also confirm that the model is statistically sound, there is no major autocorrelation, and the use of clustered robust standard errors ensure the reliability of the estimates. So these results highlight how not just economic fundamentals, but policy dynamics and global shocks shape tourism flows in the CARICOM region. So let's now discuss the findings by addressing each research question. First, how do US trade policies impact tourism in CARICOM? The results clearly show that the trade policy uncertainty significantly reduces tourist arrivals, highlighting the power of perception and policy signals on consumer behavior. Moreover, this effect became even more severe during the COVID-19 pandemic. This suggests that policy instability, especially in times of crisis, erodes consumer confidence and dampens tourism flows. Second, how do regional trade agreements affect tourism? Well, agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement and the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act are generally associated with increased trade and investment. They had no statistically significant direct effect on tourism flows. However, the Economic Partnership Agreement did show a negative and significant effect, suggesting that liberalization policies may not always account for or benefit all sectors equally. It's possible that certain agreements prioritize goods over services, leaving tourism more vulnerable to external spillovers. Third, regarding macroeconomic drivers, GDP per capita in CARICOM countries had a positive but statistically weak influence on tourism. This suggests that while economic strength may enhance destination quality, external shocks play a much larger role in influencing international travel decisions. Additionally, distance continues to matter, supporting the gravity model theory that proximity to source markets is essential. So in summary, these findings confirm that trade-related shocks, not just domestic growth, are key drivers of tourism volatility in small open economies like those in the Caribbean. So the results of this study offer important policy implications for CARICOM countries that are highly dependent on tourism. First, there's a pressing need to diversify the tourism source markets. Many CARICOM countries are overly reliant on the United States, making them vulnerable to US policy shocks or economic downturns. Expanding tourist outreach to markets like Canada, the UK, Latin America could help mitigate these risks and stabilize tourism flows. Second, policymakers should work toward aligning trade agreements with tourism goals. For instance, the Economic Partnership Agreement was found to have a negative impact on tourism, likely because it focused on goods trade, not services. So future trade deals should consider direct and indirect impacts on tourism and include input from tourism stakeholders during negotiations. Third, CARICOM countries need to build resilience in the tourism sector against global shocks like pandemics or trade disruptions. This could involve crisis management, frameworks, more targeted marketing, and investments in digital infrastructure to support higher value tourism offerings. Finally, although some trade agreements did not show significant direct effects, their indirect benefits, such as increased foreign direct investment, improved air transport, or better road infrastructure, can still support the tourism industry. So strategic planning is needed to leverage these spillover benefits through public-private partnerships and coordinated development strategies. So together, these recommendations form a more integrated approach, one that acknowledges the interplay between trade policy and tourism, and aims to enhance the long-term sustainability of the region's most vital export service. So here brings me to the end of my presentation, and I want to thank everyone for listening.
Thank you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Delight. Good afternoon, all. Well, Tia, I think having read the paper, I think it was a very good paper. And given the current economic environment we're in, the body of work is timely, as it's necessary for us in the region, especially the tourism dependent economies, to understand the impact of U.S. trade policies on tourist arrivals. And we all know what has been occurring and what the evolving developments in terms of the tariffs and such like. So I think it's a very good paper, and as the author said, there's an overwhelming amount of literature underpinning the importance of trade policies and their impact, but limited studies analyze the trade policies and their direct impact on the demand for tourism. So I fully agree, and the paper, I think, is a solid work, but I just have a few comments that I think can pretty much enhance your study. And the first, I know you mentioned the data limitation, but looking at your paper, I think the study can benefit from expanding your data series, making it more current, because it's a bit dated because you did from 96 to 2001. So I think extending it would help us to capture post-COVID developments, which is missing, that's a missing element from the paper. So I think you can expand in the data set, which is necessary. You'll be able to capture the current developments ongoing in terms of U.S. trade policies. So that's one. And I think the second comment would be, I think the gravity model, model that you use, it's pretty solid and it's a quite good analysis. And I know you did some robustness checks. I won't go through it again in the paper. However, I think that the paper, another check you can apply to look at, to address the whole indigeneity issue would be if you can use a generalized method moments estimation technique to see how that could give you more robust output, more robust. And in another comment that looking at the paper, I think that the importance of a topic can be highlighted a bit better by including, in terms of readability and the motivation of the paper. I think you could substantially improve it by adding some visualization, because I noticed that you have two charts in the appendix A, but you can try to, so you can subsume them in the body of the paper and even try to see if you can include another one or two charts, like look at the change in tourist arrivals in the region and such like. So could make the paper, just enhance it a bit better, because I think your study is very topical for us right now in the region, given what we're facing in terms of U.S. trade policies. So I think it's something that that I think the region would find very important, and we should for us to keep abreast with, and it's a good body of work. But I think you can just enhance it a bit, especially in terms of the, like I said, the data, because I think a lot has been happening in terms of the post-COVID, and we're talking about the new normals now, so I think you'll be able to capture those in your study once you extend the data series. Okay, thank you.
Yes, I would just like to say thank you for your thoughtful comments and feedback, and I would definitely take them into consideration when moving forward with the paper.
Okay, short to the point. So the floor is now open for general questions and comments on Tia's paper. And we have about 10 minutes, so who wants to go first? So if there are no okay.
I'll break the ice. Good afternoon. Thanks, Tia, for the paper. I didn't read the paper, but I wanted to find out if you had a more, lengthy discourse on the transmission channels from trade policy uncertainty to tourism arrivals, because most of the trade policy changes have been on the good side, not necessarily the services. So in terms of the transmission channel, how did you map that out? Is it to import prices and the impact of import prices on tourism arrivals? If you could shed some more details there.
I didn't really have a lengthy discussion on it in the paper. I touched on it in the literature review, but I also made a note with respect to foreign direct investment when I was speaking on it in my discussion. So in terms of the transmission channel, I mainly looked at it with foreign direct investment, but not a lengthy discussion in the paper.
So Tia, if I may follow on that point, I may have missed it, but uh, um, did you actually include measures of investment in your empirical test? And do we actually have information on investment in the tourism industry?
No, in the empirical test, I did not include investments, but what was the last question again? If we actually,
Well, we actually have, so I think, you yourself mentioned, as you say, that the way that one would expect that trade policy, because, it's called trade policy. It's mainly about the imports and physical exports. So it isn't immediately obvious why tourism would be affected. But you did mention that uncertainty about trade policy might affect investment in the tourism. That's, in fact, that's what I was. But so, or I think the thing that is puzzling us is the fact that in the study, the empirical study didn't actually look at investment. Yeah. So you need to think about that. Okay.
okay.